Before we jump into Module 2, we should remind ourselves of what the heck we're doing this for, because we got plenty of other things we could do. Your time is valuable. My time is valuable. We're about to start summer. We're doing this because there are many uncertainties facing us in the fall, but simultaneously there is a huge certainty that our students are going to come to us with larger gaps than ever. And so what we're trying to do as a secondary staff is just come together before we launch into summer around some things that science suggests are pretty safe to bet on. The good news in this module is that you get to select the articles that you believe will be most relevant to your situation. I think one of them best suits your content area, the questions that you're wrestling with as a teacher right now, what your school is trying to do in the fall, whatever. You get to pick. I'm going to give you sort of a verbally annotated bibliography with a bunch of links, and then you go ahead and dive in. Bad news, you're not going to be able to listen to my monotone voice read you these articles. You're going to have to read these ones yourself. Good news, though, we are going to be strict on a time limit for these articles. What's up with the time limit? The time limit is because a lot of times as teachers, we're busy and we tell ourselves, I don't have time to read professionally. But I think as this little PD of ours helps to show, we actually don't have time to not read professionally because there are some things that provide us deep insights into how we can get more out of our work as a teacher and less effortfully. So the way to solve the I don't have time to read professionally problem is we find good, reliable places from which to get good actionable information. It's based on sound evidence or sound thinking or whatever. And then to come to these sources and just say, I have 45 minutes to read. I'm going to set a timer for 45 minutes and I'm going to read. And I'm going to get as much as I can out of this article or these articles, as much as I can in 45 minutes. So we're going to practice that kind of ruthlessly efficient professional reading right now. And we're going to set a timer for 45 minutes. And during that time, I just want you to select whichever the articles look interesting to you, queue them up, keep an eye on your timer, and then try to get as much out of those articles as you can in 45 minutes. And then you're going to move on. You're going to go and you're going to do something really nice for your family, for yourself, for your neighbor. Maybe you're going to go to the Cedar Springs Brewing Company. You're going to say, I'd like a growler. Maybe a growler of soda. Maybe a growler of something a little bit stiffer. You know what I mean? I don't know what you're going to do, but you're going to be done with this PD. Let's look at the articles. So our article selections are mostly written by Dan Willingham, and I've got them organized into clusters here to make your deciding a little bit easier. The math cluster obviously is recommendable to our math educators. I thought, though, that the article on math anxiety was really interesting. Willingham discusses the way that math anxiety affects working memory, and working memory is a critical principle of understanding how much of a cognitive load that students are able to grapple with at a given time. So when they're experiencing anxiety, it eats up part of their working memory and makes problem solving more difficult, especially for complicated problems. And the nice part about this is that math anxiety isn't necessarily a terminal condition for students. There are things that we can do to influence it. The reading cluster gets at an important concept, the concept that much of the curricula that English language arts teachers are given focuses on teaching students reading comprehension strategies, but actually reading comprehension strategies are not, they don't require nearly as much in-class repetition or instruction as we are often told to give them. So this is another one of those article pairs that will give us more available time for instruction on other things. So I recommend that to anyone who's trying to teach students how to read. This could also be true for folks who are pushing into inclusion classes in a reading setting. This memory cluster is going to be more generic. It can suit a lot of our interests, I think. The idea that we shouldn't memorize anything for school because we're just going to forget it all afterwards is dealt with really well in this article. And Willingham does go to bat for us and demonstrate why, even though you think you forget some things from school, it might not be quite so straightforward. This article is amazing if you're trying to teach students to do well on any type of assessment, if you're trying to teach students to memorize anything, or if you're trying to teach your own children at home how to study more effectively. We as secondary educators, I think, owe our students a lot of embedded instruction on what works well for studying and what doesn't. So this review for Scientific American talks about some of those classic memory enhancing practices like retrieval practice, spaced practice, and debunks some of our more common practices such as rereading or highlighting a text as a study method. And here's another one on memory that's good. This thinking cluster is an interesting one. There's a lot of talk in education about how the point of a history class is not to teach students history, it's to make students think like historians. It's not to teach students science in a science class, it's to get them thinking like scientists. Willingham talks in this piece about how inflexible knowledge is inseparable from the development of expertise. You can't do deep level thinking without having some surface level knowledge. This one deals with a theory that we all probably were taught in our School of Education classes, Piaget's idea of developmental stages. And Willingham approaches this from the perspective of cognitive science. And I think it does a very good job kind of giving us a little more of a robust way of thinking about what is quote-unquote developmentally appropriate for students, which not as big of a concern for us in secondary as it would be in elementary, but still a lot of us carry around this Piaget baggage, and I think this is a good article if you wrestle with that. This one gets pretty technical, but it's a Willingham piece that he wrote for a state-level Department of Education in Australia about how to teach critical thinking. You'll learn some of the seminal studies in understanding how critical thinking is developed, what it is and isn't from, but it's a little bit of a longer article, so you probably wouldn't have time to read anything else if you choose that one. Okay, now motivation. This is hugely relevant to the fall. If we think about remote learning or hybrid or whatever, the challenge of motivating all of our students to do the work of learning in a non-traditional instruction scenario is a big challenge. So he gets at some of the fundamentals of student motivation when he talks about the role of praise in motivating or demotivating students, the role of rewards. And this is a short one, it's just an op-ed, but I find it interesting. It's why you and I are less curious about the things that we'd actually like to be curious about, and why we can get tricked by clickbaity headlines and stuff like that. And then this is more of a smorgasbord here, the other issues cluster. It talks in this piece about how technology and multitasking, whether or not that has changed the way that students learn. This is discussing the connection between sleep and learning. And this one is about whether or not we can teach our students to be more self-controlled. Also a very relevant topic when we're asking students to do so much work on a computer, which is like a temptation factory. I mean, opening a new tab is just Control-Shift-T, and there I go, far away from Google Classroom to whatever website suits my fancy. So can teachers increase student self-control is an important topic for us as we enter into the fall. All right, these are shorter pieces. These are not as robust as the American Federation of Teachers style articles, but they do touch on interesting concepts, and even though they're op-eds, Willingham does a good job, I think, citing his sources. So the purpose of selecting your handful of articles is to provide you some food for thought as we approach the summer and as we approach a shared Zoom session where we get to start to wrestle with what types of practices will make the most sense no matter what we face in the fall, and what basically, how do we wisely approach the unknown? I guess that's what I'm hoping this gets us geared into discussing. All right, so select your 1 to 3 articles-ish, and I've got a timer here on the screen. You can just play this off to the side while you read. You can read on the screen. If you're able to print the articles, you could read them in print. I encourage you to annotate and take notes in the way that seems most productive for your professional learning. And if this becomes too much of a burden in terms of time, feel free to break up the reading into a couple of segments. You can see the bit.ly link for accessing that article list that I just shared with you. That'll be up on the screen the whole time. When you're finished with the timer, just take a couple of notes, and then I'll see you in the Zoom.